So the late Middle Ages are going to last from about 1300 to 1500. And this is a time of human misery and disaster. The population of Europe is going to suffer greatly from both the Hundred Years' War and the Black Death, which are both going to occur during this time. So let's talk about the late Middle Ages. The Hundred Years' War. What were the causes? The Hundred Years' War was a consequence of the growth of medieval France and England. When William the Conqueror became King of England, he tied the nobility of France to the nobility of England. As a result, tensions are going to mount over the years regarding who had the right to rule either country. The English and the French also are fierce competitors in many economic pursuits, in particular the wool trade, and control of Flemish towns vital to the wool trade. And trouble begins when the English claimed that Aquitaine, a region in the south of France. In 1329, Edward III of England paid homage, a fee, for Aquitaine to the King of France. And when Philip VI took over Aquitaine in 1337, Edward's going to respond by invading France. And this begins a series of intermittent wars that's going to last for 116 years. And therefore, we refer to it as the Hundred Years' War. If you want a date, it's up there, 1337 to 1453. So let's look at some of the major battles of the Hundred Years' War. It starts with several English victories. Many historians divide the Hundred Years' War into 4 phases. 2 phases feature English successes, followed by the French rallying to push the English out of their lands. And the war ends in 1453 when the French finally expel the English from mainland Europe. The English use of skilled archers during the war proves to be very influential to technology of the time, and it was highly effective when used against knights, whose slow, bulky armor couldn't provide sufficient defense in the face of multiple arrow attacks. This rivalry between France and Spain is kind of born here, and it's going to be seen throughout arguably the rest of history. When we look at history, anything bad for France is good for Britain, and anything bad for Britain is good for France. Even when looking at the most recent World War, World War II, when the Americans decide to go in and help the British fight, it's very important that as we attempt to liberate France from German control, that the French don't see the British first, that they see the Americans. Because if they see the British, they're less likely to throw off the German oppressors and follow the British just because of their searing hatred for the British. One of the French heroines in the Hundred Years' War is going to be Joan of Arc. If you look over here, you see a representation of Joan of Arc being burned at the stake. So why did they do that? Let's talk about it. The daughter of peasants, she's going to claim that she hears voices that told her to expel the English from France. She manages to persuade the king that she should be allowed to fight alongside men in the war due to her passion and faith. She becomes a successful soldier whose will and strength are going to inspire the French to several victories. She was eventually captured by the English and shipped to England to face trial for heresy. She's found guilty, and as a result, she will be burned at the stake by the English. One of the more interesting things we get to talk about, the plague. During the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the bubonic plague, Black Death, whichever you call it, still the same thing, is going to ravage the population of Europe. It's going to be transmitted to humans by fleas that had bitten infected rats. So the flea bite on us, who had bitten the infected rat, is going to transmit this disease. It causes very painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes. The name Black Death came from the dried blood, which would often form under the skin and cause black spots. The spread of the plague. The plague is going to start in China, and it kills millions of people in mainland Asia. Due to its highly communicable nature, meaning it's very easy to spread, it is going to spread very, very quickly throughout Europe. And if you think about sanitation and conditions back then, very conducive environment for this. It first reaches Europe in Sicily in 1347 when a merchant ship returning from China landed carrying rats with infected fleas. Trade and travel is going to help spread the plague to mainland Europe, and by 1348, it has ravaged southern Europe. By 1350, it's hit Central Europe and the British Isles, and the plague is going to spread for several reasons, um, including the outbreak of the war, so the Hundred Years' War, and more people coming in contact with each other. Um, is going to be one of the reasons it spread, and then the fact that many infected people are going to bring the disease to new locations, trying to escape the horrors of the disease. So the the transfer from human to human is going to spread the plague throughout Europe. There were a lot of popular cures for the plague. At the time, the field of medicine doesn't understand what causes the Black Death or how to cure it. So doctors are going to wear pretty strange costumes and use folk cures to kind of deal with the disease. And then some of the more absurd remedies, bathing in human urine, wearing excrement, placing dead animals in homes, wearing leeches, drinking molten gold and powdered emeralds, burning incense to get rid of the smell of the dead. And not surprisingly, these cures did little to address the real problem of the plague, and many even made the disease worse. There's some famous skits, scenes from Monty Python and the Holy Grail about the plague that are pretty humorous. You can look those up if you want. That just kind of show the absurdity of this. So, what were the effects of the plague? Well, the most obvious effect was the number of people it killed. An estimated 25 to 30 million Europeans, or roughly one third of the population. Sometimes you'll see numbers closer to half of the population, but most historians will agree on the number of about one third of the population. So the plague is also going to shake many people's faith in religion. Though many religious leaders are going to blame the plague on sin, piety and prayer offered no protection against the disease, and members of the clergy were as likely to become afflicted as anyone else. And in the face of all this, the numbers of those willing to devote their life to the church are going to dramatically decline. The population decrease caused by the plague is going to lead to an economic downturn. Both the number of people of available people to work and available laborers and consumers are going to decline sharply. And merchants and tradespeople are going to have fewer people who they can sell their products to. And so products are going to accumulate. And as products accumulate and we can't get rid of them, the price of them is going to drop. And everybody's going to lose money in this. And in addition, peasants are going to flee their land in an attempt to escape the disease. The plague is also going to influence many artists of the time, and works from this period often have very dark themes and tones to them because their lives were very dark back then. The cathedral here, pictured in France, is a prime example of this medieval Gothic architecture. So the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, is going to see a boom in the building of cathedrals and churches in Europe. And by the 11th century, a clear but short-lived style of architecture emerges called Romanesque, because it features a Roman-like style inspired by Italian basilicas. This style produced an interior that was shaped like a Latin cross. From the exterior, the Romanesque church looked very massive, with heavy horizontal lines. The central area of the church was covered with a barrel vault, supported by pillars and thick walls. There were very few windows, thus the interior was really, really gloomy. A dramatic new style, known as Gothic, is going to be introduced in the early 12th century. The architect of this style developed the ribbed vault, which worked like an umbrella to spread the weight of the roof from columns to the walls. To prevent the walls from collapsing outwards, the structure, called a flying buttress, is going to brace them from the outside. So when combined with the pointed arcs, this meant the cathedral could have larger interior spaces and larger windows, allowing the building to be filled with light. Many of these cathedrals are going to use stained glass to fill their windows, and the creation of stained glass is going to evolve into a very distinct art form. Prior to the invention of the printing press, all documents were manuscripts, meaning written by hand. This Latin phrase is also the source of the English word manuscript. Most of the time, copied manuscripts were Bibles or other religious works, such as prayer books. So the manuscripts were usually produced by monks who went about this very labor intensive task of hand copying books in special rooms called scriptorias. And the monks would also illustrate the manuscripts, a process known as illumination. And monks would illuminate manuscripts both to glorify sacred texts and to help the illiterate understand what the book was discussing. As we've kind of talked about in class, only the elite were able to read and write, and the other ones were told what it said by the educated elite. So after 1200, books become more common, and professional scribes and illustrators begin producing works. They are often commissioned by the wealthy to do so, and the illumination, the drawing of pictures and manuscripts, is going to become an art form, as well as illustrations appropriate to the story, verse, or prayer. Capital letters at the beginning of each page are going to be often decorated in bright colors and gold leaf. You'll see the examples of that over here. Have some discussion questions for you. Look at these. Put the answers to these in your notes. During the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc fought for the French and was captured by the English, who burned her at the stake as a heretic. Yet, in a way, she succeeded in helping the French kings forge a more unified nation out of their lands. How do you think she helped them do this? The greatest tragedy of the late Middle Ages was the Black Death, which resulted from Europe's starting to grow economically and interacting with the rest of the world. How did growing economic activity contribute to this tragedy? Number 3, the Middle Ages are often thought of as a time of suffering, poverty, superstition, and little change. However, they led to the Renaissance, an era of rapid growth and the flowering of European culture and learning. What strengths of medieval society might help to explain this fact? So, what was the legacy of the medieval era? The medieval era, the Middle Ages, is considered a transitional period between the classic ancient world and the Renaissance. Immediately after the fall of Rome, Europe disintegrated into a number of small kingdoms and states. Throughout this period, however, a lot of kingdoms are going to gradually evolve into states, countries, England, France, and Spain, for example. The Catholic Church is going to expand its influence throughout Western Europe with little challenge to its dominance. Although issues such as the Inquisition and the Crusades may have kind of diminished its prestige and influence. And despite the popular view of medieval Europe as the Dark Ages, many modern institutions are going to originate during this time, including universities, the parliamentary form of government, thanks to the Magna Carta, and banks. And what historians often refer to as modern Europe is going to start to take shape at the end of this medieval era into the Renaissance era. And the emergence of modern Europe is going to be shaped by other factors as well. The Renaissance, and later what we're going to get to talk about, the Reformation, and then leading into global exploration over the next 2 centuries.